2 weeks in the hospital, 2 weeks of silence, and I come home to chaos. My driveway is blocked by strangers' cars. My garden beds are trampled. The mailbox I painted last spring, gone, replaced with a sign declaring some community project in my name. I barely recognize my own house. Everything familiar is twisted into someone else's version of control. Neighbors whisper behind my back, nodding at this so-called gift I supposedly gave, while I can barely walk without wincing. Every inch of my property feels like it's been stolen, yet legally, no one seems to care. Was this a misunderstanding, or had the HOA been plotting behind my back the entire time? Before everything fell apart, my life in Willow Creek felt like it belonged in a postcard. Mornings began with the soft hum of sprinklers watering the perfectly lined flower beds, the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen, and the distant laughter of kids riding bikes down the cul-de-sac. I had spent years turning this house into more than walls and a roof. It was my sanctuary, the place where weekends meant fishing in my private lake or tending to my garden, and evenings were quiet, with the sun bleeding gold over the neighborhood. I wasn't a recluse. I greeted neighbors with a wave, sometimes stopping for small talk at the mailbox, yet I kept my privacy sacred. That balance, friendly but firm, was everything. The HOA board members were the kind you only noticed when their notices arrived. Thin envelopes of rules I mostly skimmed past. Everyone followed the same routines and social rituals, and I had learned to coexist without conflict. It was calm, predictable, routine. My lake, though, was different. It wasn't part of any communal property. I had inherited it from my father, who had spent decades building a dock and planting the surrounding pines to create a private escape from the world. To me, it was sacred. I never imagined that something so personal could become a battlefield. First, the warning signs were almost laughably small. A pamphlet slipped under the door, reminding residents about community enhancements, another about aesthetic compliance. The language was polite, almost meaningless, until it wasn't. One evening, I noticed a subtle change while walking the perimeter of my property, a freshly laid sandbar on the far end of the lake. My heart skipped. I had done no work there, and yet it looked deliberate, beautiful, manicured, perfect. Someone had built it to match the HOA's vision of improvement. I tried to brush it off, telling myself I was overreacting. Perhaps a new neighbor thought they were being helpful. It could be a misunderstanding. But when I spotted the pavilion, gleaming, brand new, stamped with a plaque praising community generosity, I froze. My name was on it. My hard-earned property, now decorated with someone else's approval, someone else's rules, and no permission asked. The sense of violation grew heavier with every step toward my house. The whispers from neighbors felt louder, sharper. It was subtle. At first, glances in the driveway, faint nods, a shadow of a smile that didn't reach the eyes. And the letters kept coming. Notices about community contributions I had never signed up for. I did not know requests for future alignment with HOA projects. Each envelope carried the weight of an invisible hand reshaping my life without my consent. I could feel the calm I had built over the years fracturing. The lake, my sanctuary, was now a stage for someone else's control. And I had no idea the storm I was about to walk into, or how far they were willing to go to rewrite the rules of my property. The days that followed the discovery of the pavilion felt surreal, as if I had stepped into someone else's life. Each morning I woke with a knot in my chest, dreading what I might find outside. And every day it got worse. Notices were waiting, on the doorstep, neatly stacked with precise, intimidating language. Violation of aesthetic standards, non-compliance with community regulations, future projects require HOA approval. It was endless. The HOA seemed determined to prove that my very existence on my property was subject to their judgment. I tried to reason with them. I attended the next board meeting, my cane tapping nervously on the polished floor. A calm explanation would make them see reason, but when I entered the room, I realized how outnumbered I was. Half a dozen board members sat in stiff chairs, arms crossed, faces unreadable. One of them, Mr. Brackett, who lived 3 streets over, looked at me with a mix of amusement and irritation. "We're just ensuring the community stays harmonious," he said, his tone dripping with condescension. "Your property's enhancements, while creative, were not approved." I opened my mouth, tried to explain the lake was private. My name had been misused on the pavilion, but my words bounced off the walls like ping-pong balls. They had prepared scripts, citations from obscure HOA bylaws, and a quiet, suffocating authority that left no room for discussion. That day, I left defeated, my pride bruised. The subtle invasion of my sanctuary had transformed into a clear assertion of control, and I felt my agency slipping through my fingers. The following week, I noticed more changes. Signs were planted along the edge of my lake, warning about community access hours, which restricted the times I could even step onto my own dock. A neighbor waved at the camera crew filming a promotional HOA video, shot right in my yard without permission. My phone rang with automated messages, and when I answered, they were polite on the surface but thinly veiled threats underneath. "Pay this fine, align your property, or face legal action." Every day brought a new rule I didn't know existed, yet they were enforced as if I had willingly agreed. I began documenting everything: photos, videos, dates, names. I needed evidence because I could feel the walls closing in on me. Every step outside became a test. Neighbors I once nodded to avoid eye contact or smirked, clearly taking pleasure in my discomfort. And then, the first real confrontation happened. Mr. Brackett knocked on my door, a clipboard in hand, a practiced look of concern plastered on his face. "We noticed some inconsistencies with your property boundaries," he said, peering over my shoulder like a cat sizing up a trapped mouse. I could feel my pulse racing. I tried to maintain my composure, explaining that the boundaries had been surveyed years ago and that my father had personally installed the markers. He smiled faintly, shrugging. "We'll send someone to verify. You'll receive a notice if adjustments are needed." The smile lingered like a shadow, friendly on the surface but menacing underneath. It didn't stop there. The following day, an inspector arrived unannounced, measuring, taking notes, pointing at trees, rocks, and even the sand on my private lake. He claimed it was for a safety evaluation. My protests were met with polite indifference. The sense of violation grew heavier each hour. Even the mail carrier seemed to avoid my gaze as she dropped off yet another envelope, fat with fines for unauthorized structures and non-compliant landscaping. Each one felt like a nail in the coffin of my peace. By the end of the month, the lake wasn't the same. Canoes that once rested in silence now bore HOA logos. Life preservers hung on my dock, stamped with rules I had never agreed to. I confronted one of the volunteer workers, asking how they had access to my property. He smiled, shrugged, and said, "It's a community improvement." Improvement. The word tasted bitter in my mouth, like someone was taking my life and repackaging it as generosity, then expecting gratitude. I began to feel trapped inside my own home. Every visitor, every neighbor, every sound outside made me flinch. Even the wind through the pines sounded conspiratorial. I started waking at odd hours, imagining the subsequent intrusion, the next fine, the next insult, disguised as courtesy. My sense of control was gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety that I couldn't shake. And yet, beneath the fear, a small flame of determination was kindling. They thought they could humiliate me quietly, make me bend without resistance. But I wasn't ready to surrender. Then came the public notice. It wasn't an envelope this time. It was posted at the entrance to my street, a significant official-looking announcement praising community efforts and detailing my generous contributions to the lake's beautification. My name was printed in bold. My property had been co-opted, my story rewritten, my reputation appropriated. Neighbors pointed, nodded, whispered. Some congratulated me, genuinely thinking I had allowed the changes. Others smirked, knowing I had been sidelined. The humiliation cut deeper than any fine or threat could. I spent that night pacing the house, thinking about the weeks I had spent in the hospital, recovering from my own body's betrayal, only to return to this battlefield. Each rule, each notice, each intrusion was a reminder that my property and my life were no longer entirely mine. The HOA's reach had grown beyond its mandate, and its audacity seemed limitless. I realized, somewhere between anger and disbelief, that this wasn't about the lake anymore. It was about power, control, and proving who ruled the neighborhood. And, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, I received an email that froze my blood. A neighbor had filed a complaint alleging dangerous obstruction on my dock, claiming my own fishing equipment was a hazard. The irony was sharp, but so was the implication. I could face penalties, fines, even legal action simply for using what was mine. It was the first proper escalation, a hint that the HOA's harassment had moved from subtle intimidation to actionable attack. The next morning, I awoke to a sight that made my stomach drop. Surveyors were on my lawn again, measuring the edges of my property, marking stakes in the ground, as if laying claim to my life. I stepped outside, cane in hand, my voice shaking, with frustration as I demanded they leave. One of them looked at me with a faint smile and replied, "We're just following HOA directives." That phrase, so innocuous, so bureaucratic, felt like a hammer striking my skull. Following the directives didn't make this right. I contacted the HOA pleading for clarity, for rules, for some explanation that would make sense. My emails were returned with templates, each one more formal than the last, citing obscure clauses and vague responsibilities. It became clear they had no intention of reasoning with me. The goal was to wear me down, to break me mentally and emotionally, to bend me to their vision of control. Tension in the neighborhood escalated as if my distress had become public entertainment. Neighbors began reporting minor infractions, overgrown, weeds, misplaced garden stones, even the angle of my dock. Every day brought a new fine, a new letter, a new demand to pay or comply. The psychological weight of being constantly scrutinized and judged was exhausting. I couldn't relax, couldn't step outside without feeling their eyes on me. The sanctuary I had built with my own hands was no longer mine. Then came the confrontation that would haunt me for weeks. At the HOA board meeting, I faced Mr. Brackett and his allies in a room full of paperwork, cameras, and self-righteous determination. They recited rules I hadn't read, cited violations I hadn't committed. They presented diagrams of my property that had been altered to fit their narrative. Each word was calculated to humiliate, each gesture designed to undermine my confidence. I tried to speak, tried to assert my rights, but their walls of authority left no room for argument. Feeling powerless, I left the meeting and returned home, only to find yet another layer of intrusion. Orange safety tape cordoning off sections of my lake, signs warning against unauthorized use, and workers installing gates and fences I hadn't requested. My frustration reached a boiling point. I documented everything, recording video after video, capturing every moment of violation and abuse. But the realization hit me like a punch. These recordings were just evidence. They didn't stop them from continuing. I became hyper-aware of every movement on my property. Every car that slowed at the end of the street, every shadow crossing the yard, every whisper from a neighbor made me tense. Sleep became difficult. Anxiety clawed at me constantly. Yet, amidst the fear, anger, and humiliation, a resolve formed. I wasn't going to allow my life to be rewritten without a fight. If the HOA wanted a battle, they were going to get one. But on my terms, the subsequent escalation came unexpectedly. I received a letter threatening legal action if community standards were not met immediately. The wording was precise, cold, and manipulative. Immediate compliance required. Failure to adhere will result in fines, legal proceedings, and removal of unauthorized structures. My hands shook as I read it. They weren't bluffing. They had crossed a line. Now this was no longer just psychological harassment. It was a direct attack on my property and rights. In the following days, I noticed more neighbors taking sides, with some cautiously supporting me and others siding, with the HOA nodding or smirking as they passed by my yard. I realized I had become the center of a storm that had nothing to do with community improvement and everything to do with power. The lake, the pavilion, even the sand, things I had once enjoyed quietly, had become symbols of control, battlegrounds in a war I hadn't started. Then came the night that nearly broke me. I returned home to find spotlights illuminating my dock, workers moving with clipboards and measuring tools, and my name once again used on signs praising community service. I could barely breathe. It felt as if I had been erased, my property rebranded by a system that refused to acknowledge my ownership. And that's when I realized they weren't just testing boundaries, they were attempting to rewrite reality. At that moment, I knew I had two choices: continue to endure, letting the HOA strip away my home and dignity, or fight back in a way that would make them regret underestimating me. The anger that had simmered beneath the surface boiled over, mixing with determination. I would not be passive. I began researching every clause, every bylaw, every loophole. I spoke with lawyers, neighbors, and property experts. Every detail mattered. Every rule they used as a weapon could be turned into my shield. And just when I thought the pressure couldn't intensify further, I received an unexpected visit. A delivery truck rolled onto my driveway carrying materials I hadn't ordered, workers who wouldn't leave, and a notice, again in my name, stating that necessary improvements were underway. My pulse raced. This was no accident. The HOA had encroached on my property, my life, and my rights, and there was no immediate solution in sight. I realized the war had begun in earnest. Every day was a battle, every interaction a challenge. I couldn't let them see me falter, couldn't let them claim victory. I began planning, strategizing, documenting, and preparing for the confrontation that would eventually become unavoidable. The tension, the fear, the humiliation, all of it was building toward a moment of reckoning, a point where either I would reclaim my property and dignity or succumb to their relentless control. And that's when I first glimpsed the strategy that would change everything. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but a clue that the HOA had overstepped in a way that could be exposed. A misplaced signature, a rule interpreted beyond its authority, an assumption they had made about my consent. For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope appeared amidst the storm. I wasn't powerless. I could fight, and perhaps even turn the tables in a way they never anticipated. Little did I know how far I would have to push, how high the stakes would climb, and how satisfying the eventual victory would feel. The following steps weren't just about property. They were about pride, justice, and reclaiming control from those who believed they had the right to dictate my life. The morning sunlight barely reached my driveway when I knew today would be different. Weeks of harassment, fines, unauthorized improvements, and public humiliation had built to a crescendo, and I felt it in my bones. This was the day the battle would either break me or break them. I moved deliberately through my yard, cane tapping, eyes scanning every corner of my property. The lake, the pavilion, the sand, all symbols of their overreach, stood before me like a challenge. Every worker, every sign, every letter they had sent me had led to this moment. I had spent nights poring over HOA bylaws, city ordinances, and property rights. I had photographed every intrusion, documented every interaction, and falsified every misplaced signature, as well as every approval. For the first time, I wasn't just reacting, I was preparing to strike. Today, the board wouldn't get the satisfaction of another passive response. Today, the rules they twisted against me would become their own undoing. By mid-morning, the street had begun to stir. Neighbors peeked through blinds, some curious, others cautious. I could feel their judgment, their whispered speculations. But for once, it didn't matter. My focus was on the confrontation ahead of me. I had arranged for a certified legal notice to be delivered, an official injunction demanding cessation of all unauthorized activity, citing violations of local laws and property rights. It was bold, direct, and impossible to ignore. As the HOA representatives arrived, clipboard in hand, their usual condescending smiles were replaced with flickers of unease. They hadn't expected resistance at this scale. Mr. Brackett's eyes widened slightly as I met him on the driveway, cane in one hand, stack of documents in the other. I felt the weight of weeks of anger, fear, and frustration compress into a single, sharp focus. No more polite requests, no more explanations. Today, they would feel the power of someone they had underestimated. I laid the documents on the hood of their car, pointing to each clause, each citation, each violation of procedure. "These are your limits," I said, voice steady but firm. "You've overstepped in every possible way, trespassed repeatedly, and misrepresented my consent. I've documented everything. If any action is taken after today, it will be on you, not me." The silence that followed was electric, heavy with disbelief. The board members exchanged glances, their usual authority faltering under the weight of facts, law, and undeniable evidence. They tried to argue, claiming community interest and improvement. Still, I cut through each excuse with precision, referencing city codes, property rights, and the apparent misuse of my name on their plaques and signs. Every word was deliberate, each rebuttal striking like a hammer. They were trained to intimidate and manipulate, but today, I held the upper. Hence, the imbalance of power I had endured for weeks had flipped. Then came the public moment. I had invited a local journalist, someone curious about neighborhood disputes, to witness the final confrontation. Cameras rolled as the representatives attempted, their standard spiel, their carefully rehearsed lines falling flat. The journalist asked pointed questions, exposing contradictions and overreach in real time. I could see the color drain from their faces and the tight-lipped expressions falter. Neighbors who had once whispered behind my back now watched openly, some nodding in acknowledgement, others muttering apologies for doubting me. But the peak wasn't just about evidence or witnesses. It was the moment I reclaimed my space physically. I walked to the dock, gesturing at the unauthorized pavilions and sandbars, explaining clearly which structures were theirs to remove immediately and which belonged to me. Workers hesitated, unsure whom to obey. For the first time, my authority over my property was both visible and undeniable. Every glance, every step, every sound reinforced that the balance had shifted. I was no longer the passive target. I was the one dictating terms. The confrontation escalated further when Mr. Brackett, frustrated and desperate, tried to dismiss the notices, claiming procedural loopholes. I countered with multiple points of law, recorded communications, and notarized evidence. His voice, once booming with dominance, shrank to a strained whisper. Colleagues floundered, murmuring among themselves, realizing that the tables had turned, in front of cameras and neighbors alike. The humiliation they had subtly inflicted on me for weeks was now mirrored back tenfold. At one point, I noticed that the sand near the pavilion had been shifted, indicating an apparent last-minute attempt to maintain the appearance of community improvements. I grabbed my camera, snapping photos of footprints, misaligned planks, and new signage. Every small detail was another proof point. Every misstep by the HOA was captured, cataloged, and is now indisputable. The air was thick with tension, a strange mix of fear, anger, and disbelief. Hours passed, each moment more intense than the last. Notices were read aloud, disputes analyzed, and my voice, calm yet firm, became the anchor in a storm of intimidation. I could feel the board unraveling in real time. Their legal threats, once tools of terror, had become chains they could no longer wield effectively. My preparation, documentation, and unshakable stance had transformed weeks of abuse into undeniable leverage. By late afternoon, the board relented, retreating into hushed conferences. At the same time, I stood on my property, feeling an unfamiliar sense of victory. My neighbors began to emerge, some applauding discreetly, others approaching with cautious congratulations. The humiliation, the manipulation, the fines, all of it had led to this moment of reversal. I wasn't just surviving. I was reclaiming everything they had tried to take from me, and yet, even in triumph, a quiet unease lingered. The lake, my sanctuary, had been invaded, my privacy breached, my trust tested. But now, I had a choice. Let the past weigh me down, or use this experience to set boundaries stronger than ever before. My victory was real, but the lessons were sharper than any fine or notice could ever convey. As the board packed up and left, a final moment crystallized in my mind. I stood on the dock, the sun glinting off the water, thinking of every letter, every trespass, every insult I had endured. And I realized something profound. Power wasn't in intimidation, or rules, or plaques. It was in knowledge, preparation, and the courage to assert one's rights, even when the odds seemed impossible. I turned toward the lake, looking at the sand, the pavilions, the water's edge, and knew that what came next would define not just the outcome of this dispute, but the kind of life I would live moving forward. The storm had passed, but the calm that followed was mine to shape. And as I stepped back onto solid ground, I whispered to myself, almost in disbelief, they had underestimated me, and they would never make that mistake again. The days after the confrontation were surreal. The air felt lighter, the sunlight sharper, and the lake, my lake, finally belonged to me again. For weeks, I had walked through my yard with a sense of tension coiled tight around my chest. Every shadow a potential threat, every glance a hidden accusation. But now, that weight was lifted, replaced with a quiet, resolute calm that came from knowing the fight had been won. Not through brute force, but through persistence, preparation, and an unwavering commitment to protecting what was mine. The HOA, humbled and visibly shaken, retreated behind a wall of bureaucracy. Notices stopped arriving in my mailbox, and the workers ceased their unwelcome improvements. Their once familiar tactics, threats, fines, and intimidation no longer carried the same power. Neighbors who had once whispered or gossiped now offered small gestures of acknowledgement, a nod of respect, a quiet good job at the mailbox, or a hesitant handshake. Some apologized, some admitted they had been swept up in the board's agenda without realizing it. Slowly, the street regained a semblance of normalcy. However, the scars of the conflict remained in memory, if not in the physical landscape. I spent the following weeks restoring my property to its original state, which I had carefully curated for years. The sandbars were reshaped, the pavilions removed, and the signs proclaiming my supposed gifts were gone. Every inch of my lake reflected sunlight again without intrusion, every ripple a reminder of reclaimed space. I rebuilt my dock, adjusted the canoe racks, and tended to my gardens with renewed focus. Each task was more than maintenance. It was an act of reclaiming my life, my agency, and my peace of mind. but the experience had changed me in ways that were deeper than the physical repairs could reflect. I had learned, painfully, how easily rights could be encroached upon, how even subtle manipulation could erode a person's sense of security and autonomy. I had faced weeks of uncertainty, public scrutiny, and the suffocating reach of a powerful board, and I had endured. That endurance, combined with strategic action, had led to a turning point where the balance of power shifted decisively in my favor. It wasn't just about property. It was about asserting one's presence and protecting the sanctity of one's life. The community began to notice. Conversations at neighborhood gatherings, once tense or dismissive, now carried a sense of caution. The board members, once confident and unassailable, became quieter, more measured in their interactions. They no longer assumed compliance or submission. They had learned, publicly and privately, that their authority had limits. And while some tension remained, after all, old habits die slowly, the overall dynamic had shifted. I had earned respect, not through aggression, but through persistence, evidence, and the courage to confront injustice directly. The legal documentation I had prepared also played a critical role in preventing future overreach. Letters and notations were carefully filed, notarized, and distributed where necessary, creating a permanent record of the board's prior actions and my responses. This paperwork served as both protection and leverage, ensuring that any future attempts at manipulation could be met with immediate and informed counteraction. The HOA now approached any matter involving my property with caution, weighing each decision carefully to avoid another public debacle. The most unexpected outcome was the change in my own perspective. I realized that I had been more reactive than proactive for too long. I had assumed that goodwill, politeness, and routine compliance would shield me from overreach. I had relied on the invisibility of my private life to protect my sanctuary. The confrontation had taught me that boundaries must be actively maintained, that vigilance is as necessary as trust. I had become not just a homeowner defending property, but a guardian of personal sovereignty, aware that peace is maintained only through assertive, informed action. Neighbors began seeking my advice, quietly at first, then more openly. They inquired about procedures, property rights, and how to deal with overzealous boards. I became a quiet authority, sharing knowledge and perspective without judgment, helping others avoid the same mistakes. What had begun as a profoundly personal battle became a source of insight for the community. I realized that conflict, while painful, can also illuminate gaps in understanding, highlight vulnerabilities, and ultimately strengthen the bonds of shared responsibility when approached with care and integrity. As for the lake, it returned to its serene state, but now it held a new meaning. Each morning, as I watched the mist rise off the water and the sun shimmer across the surface, I felt the tangible results of my perseverance. It was more than just a body of water. It was a testament to the idea that persistence, careful planning, and a refusal to yield to intimidation can reclaim what is rightfully yours. Every ripple, every wave reflected not just sunlight, but the lessons learned from weeks of harassment and subtle warfare. I also took steps to prevent such a situation from recurring. Property markers were reinforced, boundaries clarified in writing, and a personal record system was maintained for any future correspondence. Every step was both precautionary and empowering. Whereas I had previously felt vulnerable, I now felt in control. The power dynamic that had defined the conflict had been permanently altered. My voice, my consent, and my ownership could no longer be ignored, dismissed, or twisted. The board's influence waned, not solely through confrontation, but also through exposure and accountability. The community had witnessed a reversal of roles, a moment in which authority had been effectively and fairly challenged. That visibility created a ripple effect. Rules were scrutinized more closely, processes became more transparent, and board members began to recognize the limits of their reach. My victory was private in action but public in consequence, a lesson etched into the neighborhood's collective awareness. Emotionally, the resolution was profound. I no longer woke with a sense of dread, flinched at the mail carrier's footsteps, imagined every shadow as a threat. Relief and satisfaction replaced the tension that had plagued me for weeks. The sense of helplessness and frustration had been transformed into empowerment. I had faced what felt like an insurmountable wave of control, manipulation, and intimidation, and had emerged not only intact, but more assertive, more confident, and wiser. Even small rituals regained significance. Walking along the lake's edge without anxiety, arranging flowers in my garden without fear of criticism, hosting friends without worrying about hidden agendas, the everyday acts of life returned, imbued with a sense of triumph. Each moment reminded me of the victory that had been hard won and the clarity it brought. Vigilance, knowledge, and courage were more valuable than deference or avoidance in preserving one's autonomy. The story also left an enduring impression on the neighborhood's collective conscience. Board members, while still present, approached their duties with newfound caution. The community discussions about improvements and aesthetic compliance became more transparent, less personal, and more respectful of individual rights. I had set a precedent that authority could be challenged intelligently, strategically, and successfully. The balance of power shifted, permanently altering how disputes would be handled going forward. Looking back, the conflict felt almost like a crucible, a trial by fire that tested patience, resilience, and intelligence. I had been forced to confront fear, frustration, and humiliation. Yet it also illuminated strengths I hadn't fully recognized: meticulousness, resolve, and the ability to act decisively under pressure. The battle for my property became a defining chapter, not just in defending my lake, but in understanding the importance of agency, preparedness, and assertiveness in the face of systematic overreach. The takeaway became crystal clear. Control is maintained not by silence or avoidance, but through vigilance, documentation, and readiness to assert one's rights. The power of knowledge, combined with careful preparation and calm assertiveness, can dismantle even the most entrenched forms of intimidation. What had seemed like an insurmountable challenge was ultimately an opportunity to establish clarity, respect, and protection for the future. Months later, as I stood on the dock watching the sun rise, the lake rippling gently beneath my gaze, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known for weeks. The ordeal had left scars, but it had also forged resilience. The neighborhood had been subtly yet significantly reshaped, and I had emerged not just as a homeowner who reclaimed property, but as someone who understood the stakes of asserting rights, the value of preparation, and the importance of never underestimating the consequences of overreach. My life returned to its rhythm, quieter now, more deliberate. The lake became a symbol of hard-earned sovereignty, my garden a testament to patience, and my home a fortress built not just of bricks and timber, but of lessons learned and boundaries firmly established. Every ripple of water, every sunbeam, glinting off the sand, reminded me of the journey of tension, struggle, and triumph. I had survived the storm of rules, fines, and harassment, and not only had I endured, but I had also won. And in the quiet moments, I couldn't help but think about the broader truth the ordeal revealed. Authority, unchecked and arrogant, will test anyone it perceives as weak, but knowledge, preparation, courage, and persistence can turn the tide, transforming fear into empowerment, harassment into clarity, and injustice into a lasting lesson. The HOA had underestimated me, my determination, and my patience. They had assumed I would comply silently. Instead, I had taken back my life, my lake, my home, and my dignity. Proof that no amount of intimidation could override what was rightfully mine. As I watched the neighborhood wake up, children laughing in the distance, birds circling overhead, and the gentle shimmer of the lake stretching out before me, I felt a smile spread across my face. The battle was over, but the lessons would remain forever. Boundaries had been asserted, respect reclaimed, and a community subtly reshaped to honor fairness and personal sovereignty. I had emerged not just victorious, but transformed, carrying forward the knowledge that standing firm, even when the odds seem impossible, can change everything. And as I set down my coffee on the dock railing and let the morning breeze wash over me, a thought lingered in my mind. The storm had passed, but the lake and my life were mine, utterly and undeniably, and anyone who tried to take that away would find themselves facing the same unwavering determination I had discovered within myself.